My book, The Land of Ale and Gloom, Discovering the Pacific Northwest, is sort of a book about a book about this book. If you can see that, this is Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, initially published maybe 40 years prior to the final publication in 1621. He sort of worked on it his whole life. And it's one of these sort of bizarre Renaissance era relics that have come down to us. But I had this book for years and years and years. And I thought, why do I have this book? And I realized, well, I'm kind of melancholy myself. So I started reading it, and then it happened to coincide with the summer of 2016, whenever I was touring the Northwest and thinking about different things. And it all started to seem related in certain strange ways. And so my own feelings of melancholy and Robert Burton's 1,200-page single-space treatise on melancholy, along with a lot of craft beer and Northwest sort of history and poetry and esoterica, is what my book is about. I guess you could call it a collection of essays related to Pacific Northwest places. You could probably call it a travel book, restricted to the Northwest region, I'm not sure, but creative nonfiction. And yeah, so I thought I would read just from the opening and maybe slightly beyond that, but I won't go too long, just to give a little sense of what it's like. The introduction is titled All That David Copperfield Crap, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Drink More Beer. In the fall of 1979, President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was awoken at 3 a.m. with a report that the Soviets had launched a massive nuclear attack against the United States. Knowing the Soviets had subs armed with ballistic missiles off the Atlantic seaboard, Brzezinski calculated the administration had just a few minutes to decide whether to press the button and retaliate, thereby incinerating and irradiating the entire Northern Hemisphere. In the logic of the arms race, the United States was winning the Cold War because the Soviets possessed only enough thermonuclear warheads to kill every man, woman, and squirrel in America 5,000 times over, whereas America had enough to kill all the Soviets 10,000 times over, with the only way to maintain this delicate peace being the pointing of all these weapons at each other. Such was Brzezinski's dilemma. Lucky for civilization, it was a false alarm, a training video that was somehow mistaken for live fire. Brzezinski never even bothered to wake up President Carter, instead leaving the commander-in-chief to sleep on more important matters, such as his decision to legalize home brewing, which had been banned since Prohibition. Carter's wisdom cleared the path for states to allow the opening of brew pubs for the selling of these newly legit microbrews, as craft beers were known back then. Now, I was born in the spring of 1979, and such was the world I found myself dropped into, one with a lot of bizarre and frightening things, alongside some enlightened and pleasant things. Skip forward a few decades, past a storied college basketball career that saw me set the school record, not for assists or three-pointers, but torn ACLs and sprained ankles as well. Stints as an honest used car salesman, a night-blind pizza delivery man, and a narcoleptic security guard. The eventual return to school for a few graduate degrees of dubious practicality, all topped off with approximately 30,000 miles of brooding and aimless car travel throughout the American West. And I awoke one day in the spring of 2016, not to a phone call heralding Armageddon, but to a pair of melancholy realizations. Now, first, thanks to all that higher education soaked up while avoiding the workaday world, I'd ended up working in higher education myself, if as that lowliest of intellectual serfs, the community college adjunct instructor. And the academic year was winding down, which reminded me of my own student days and how I'd cherished summer's freedoms. But this only served as a reminder that I was no longer quite so young. In fact, the paired digits of my numerical age suggested in no uncertain terms that I was about halfway dead. This is no epiphany, of course. Everybody gets older. Everybody over the age of approximately 7 knows this, and we must all eventually come to grips with our own mortality. So why should I be any different? Who awarded me a patent on Gloom? But sometimes it's the obvious things that strike the deepest chord, and I'm hardly the first guy to squirm when confronted with this particular thought. Take Jack Kerouac, a writer who I discovered young, when you're supposed to discover him, and whose books I've loved ever since. In Desolation Angels, having spent the summer of 1956 high on a desolate mountaintop in the North Cascades, half mad from writing Buddhist poems and killing innocent mice, Jack catches a reflection of himself in a darkened window and thinks how the deepening lines on his face indicate he's come to the halfway point of his life, to middle age, to, in his words, the decay and strife all to come, when an old fart like himself will no longer find any girls willing to take him to bed. That's the sort of mood I found myself in. Better yet, consider the experience of Captain Meriwether Lewis. In the summer of 1805, the explorer celebrated his birthday while camped near the Bitterroot Range along the Salmon River, known today as the River of No Return. The Corps of Discovery had just reached the Continental Divide, and they'd realized there was no such thing as the Northwest Passage, which President Jefferson had sent them to find. Lewis was a close friend of Jefferson and had lived and studied with him before departing on his great journey. During this period, Jefferson reflected that Lewis was plagued by sensible depressions of mind, which seemed to run in his family. Sure enough, reflecting on his failure to find the all-important water route, Lewis's journal strikes a mournful tone. I had, in all human probability, now existed about half the period which I am to remain in this world, he wrote, that I had as yet done little, very little indeed. Meriwether Lewis was 31 when he wrote those words. Jack Kerouac had been 34 when he wrote his. I was 37. My second realization was perhaps even less insightful. I wasn't a very happy guy. In fact, I couldn't quite recall what true happiness even felt like, as if the whole notion was a con, a scam, like the get-rich-quick schemes on late-night TV. I supplemented my meager teaching income by bartending and awoke most days shrouded in a bluish fog. A strong pot of coffee would perk me up just enough to drag my brain to the classroom so as to deliver pithy remarks to bored teenagers, whereas a second pot saw my weary bones to the gym so as to forestall the inevitable heart attack, that most cliche of American deaths, before I either changed into a uniform and headed to the bar to stir martinis and shake gimlets, or came home to the couch and my four best friends, the walls. If this all sounds a bit depressing, that's because it really was. Blame the usual suspects. A half-baked career after a few false starts at other careers, all of which sounded like glorified jail sentences. Family and friends whom my lack of overt success underwhelmed and disappointed, and frustrated artistic ambitions in the form of a couple books I've written that weren't exactly generating a buzz in the publishing world. Dear author, thank you so much for querying. While we read your submission with great interest, we've decided to pass. Best of luck finding a home for this manuscript and in all your future endeavors in the restaurant industry. Signed, Dear Agent. Add to this a girlfriend recently lost under distressing circumstances, a beloved but very dead tomcat, and I was left with a question. Was there anything out there that brought me joy? Thankfully, the answer was yes. The answer was beer, cold, delicious, hoppy beer. For better or worse, and absurd as it might sound, beer was the one thing left that still made me happy. You know the sort of happiness I mean, the unthinking, spontaneous kind, Christmas morning, riding a bike on a warm April day, contentment that isn't earned by some labor or by endlessly delaying gratification or by plotting and executing some clever plan, but just falls from the sky like manna. On its face, at least, beer is a simple substance with a simple purpose. And amidst the dark swells of life's inevitable confusions and anxieties, simple things have a way of shining through the murk and buoying us when we most need buoyed. The above should not be taken to imply all was misery, though. I knew some good people, and I had my health, and the terrified and defensive sarcasm of my teens and the bitter black humor of my late 20s had mellowed into an irony that consoled me through much disappointment. But that's not quite the same thing as happiness. And so it seemed a change was in order. While I sensed an embrace of beer was part of this change, drinking myself stupid held little appeal, as I'd already thoroughly explored that route, with beer being just the tip of the iceberg in terms of mind-altering substances. And it led more or less nowhere. Instead, I asked myself what it was about beer that retained this joy-giving potential when so much else had fallen away. After all, beer is just a soup of water and grain, spiced with hops and fermented with yeast. In all probability, beer or something like it has been around since the domestication of plants and the resulting agricultural revolutions throughout the ancient world. Beer predates the wheel. Beer predates literature. In fact, beer predates nearly everything that we call civilization. In the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus famously points out that all of Western thought boils down to just one basic philosophical problem, that after suicide, there wouldn't be any more beer. So surely it wasn't just the substance itself or the fuzzy-headedness brought about by having too much of it that I was drawn to. Also, I asked what it meant for a guy hailing from a central Illinois cow town to have spent a decade bouncing around the big cities of the West Coast, Portland, San Diego, Seattle, which happened to be where the craft beer revolution was born and remain where the majority of America's best beer is made. Being from a rural place, I was naturally curious about urban life, and I liked it well enough, having come to know those cities and their beers intimately. But what about the places I'd so far overlooked? Places as small as my own hometown even. Were they making wonderful beers too? Might I find a Pilsner or a person or some strange vision out there, a clue of some kind, a trail back to the guy I'd been before life had quietly bled out its color? So come June, the long rainy season having finally passed, I decided to hit the road. The terrain of my explorations was the home of craft beer, the Pacific Northwest. And while geographical boundaries for this region vary greatly, from the thin slice of wet ground between the Cascades and the Pacific to the entire region between Alaska and San Francisco Bay, stretching clear east to the Rockies, for our purposes, as in all things, beer will be the guide. Thus, the entirety of Washington and Oregon feels about right, as Canada wasn't really part of the craft beer revolution, and California's beer scene merits a book all its own. In the back of my mind, however, I realized I wanted to explore the Northwest for reasons that ran deeper than beer. Though not a native son, I had felt an emotional kinship with the landscape from the moment I first saw it, with its leaden skies and low gray clouds and the cold and pounding surf, with the dripping and eerie forests, and that sense of damp green gloom which seeps like the constant rain into the minds and hearts of those who call the region home. But the Pacific Northwest is also a strikingly beautiful place, perhaps the most sublime America has to offer. And so I suspected I'd find arresting scenery, the sort of adventuresome people such scenery attracts, and of course, the adventurous ales such people like to drink, no matter where I traveled and no matter how backwater the locale. For a half-dead guy, this seemed reason enough to go, there being so much to taste, but so little time to savor it. Rallying from his melancholy, Jack Kerouac came down from the mountaintop and resolved to embrace the pleasures and pains of his life, along with those mad and wonderful friends who never yawn or say a commonplace thing. Rallying from his melancholy, Meriwether Lewis's birthday resolution was to live for mankind as I have heretofore lived for myself. Rallying from my own melancholy, my resolution was to go drink some beer. After all, the clock was ticking, is ticking, and that's a fact we've all got to live with somehow. Well, should I continue to read, or is that a good stopping spot? All right. The next chapter is titled The Humors of a Beer Snob. The community college was located in Everett, Washington, an old mill town 30 miles north of Seattle. Everett was blue collar and a little rough around the edges, and this from a guy who knows whereof he speaks, as my central Illinois hometown had just 1,200 people, 0 stoplights, and only one bar serving one style of beer, American light lager, alternately American light lager, spelled L-I-T-E. Unlike small town Illinois, however, Everett had a few craft breweries. One of them, Scuttlebutt, sat near the water on Port Gardner Bay Marina. Port Gardner was named by the intrepid George Vancouver, who landed his discovery near a village of the Snohomish tribe in 1792. Vancouver promptly planted a flag and claimed the area for England, fired off his cannons at nothing in particular, issued his crew a round of grog in celebration, and then, as the Snohomish watched and scratched their heads, raised anchor and sailed away once again. Soon other white men followed from the Hudson Bay Company, then prospectors and homesteaders fresh off the Oregon Trail, who brought with them guns and smallpox and a tendency to dam the rivers and cut down all the trees. But as far as Everett's breweries went, I couldn't find one that suited my taste. To borrow a term from the Onophiles, perhaps the terroir of Everett, Washington simply disagrees with me. My beer snobbery is a venial sin at worst, though, and to be dubbed a beer geek is actually an honorific of the highest order. The only real downside to loving craft beer is that craft beer gets a tad spendy, at least insofar as beer drinking goes. Then again, my teaching gig paid so little that I felt curiously obliged to rid myself of whatever pittance might have otherwise remained. As young Werther puts it, most of us work away our lives just trying to make a living and are so troubled by whatever freedom remains that we quickly find a way to be rid of it. Hence Everett's best little craft tap house, Brews Almighty. To get there, I left the college and drove south down Rockefeller Avenue, named after Standard Oil's very own, the magnate who bankrolled the town of Everett back in the late 19th century. Mr. Rockefeller was convinced by some optimistic land speculators that the deep waters of Port Gardner Bay would become the terminus of railroad tycoon Jim Hill's Great Northern, the second of the transcontinental lines linking the agricultural, mineral, and timber wealth of the Midwest with the Pacific. Everett, Washington, would become the New York City of the West, was the thought, or at least another Boston. Then I reached Hewitt Avenue, the main drag. Henry Hewitt Jr. was the speculator most responsible for Rockefeller sinking his millions into Everett, a shanty town that the historian Norman H. Clark describes ever so delicately as a mud-drenched community of idiots. Henry Hewitt's dream didn't pan out, of course. Jim Hill named Seattle the terminus of his railroad, and Rockefeller soon launched a series of cutthroat legal maneuvers to get his money back. Afterward, Everett became a resource town beset by vicious class warfare, and Hewitt Avenue became a den of drunken timbermen, last chance prostitutes, and tin-card stud. It got so seedy that the tent show evangelist Billy Sunday, a charismatic former pro baseball player turned religious entrepreneur, came to preach his righteous brand of teetotalism to the rowdy mill workers. As a countermeasure, the esteemed lawyer Clarence Darrow, of Scope's monkey trial fame, was brought in by the local Taxpayers Association to argue for keeping Everett wet, mostly so that the working class would continue subsidizing city government with their bar tabs. Port Gardner Bay sparkled down the hill as I waited out along the stoplight. Just then, a middle-aged white dude entered the crosswalk. He carried a sack of groceries. He also sported a garish red baseball cap advertising another white dude, one who fancied himself a modern-day Rockefeller. For whatever reason, halfway across the street and dead even with the Honda's windshield, this pedestrian paused to give yours truly a truly dirty look. "Make America Great Again," his cap read. Donald Trump had recently been named his party's presumptive nominee, and along with everyone else, I'd been seeing that slogan more and more often on hats, on shirts, on yard signs, and roadside billboards. Still hadn't quite gotten used to it, though. Nonetheless, I smiled politely at this man and shook off the unaccountable weirdness of our little staring match. After a quick left, I was soon parked outside Brews Almighty. Inside was a well-curated tap list. Beer people tend to be thoughtful people, and to the owner's credit, there's rarely a dull keg. While deciding what to have, I informed the reliably surly woman tending the taps that it was important I choose just the right beer, as I was celebrating. "Is it a boy," she said, "or a girl?" "Better," I said. "It's the end of spring quarter." Then she asked if I was a student up at the college, and I admitted to actually teaching English courses there. "Well, no wonder you need a beer," she said. I explained that today had been my last class until September. I was officially a free man. "Must be nice," she said, cashing those state paychecks all summer long. I agreed with her that it surely would have been nice, but for the fact that Washington State didn't see fit to pay me over the summer. When she asked how I meant to live with no income, I explained that I'd managed to squirrel away a few pennies and also planned to bartend a couple of nights a week. I'd recently filed a deferment on my high-interest student loan payments as well. I told her about this too, adding that, in my humble opinion, Uncle Sam was in the extortion racket. "Makes me glad I never got enough education to go into education," she said. Funny, I give my students that exact same advice. Then she asked how I planned to spend all my free time, and I said some traveling and a little writing, and that, more importantly, I intended to drink all the craft beer I could find. "Well, you come to the right place for that," she said. In addition to the aforementioned worthy pursuits, I also planned to finally read the book I brought along, Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy. The brick-thick volume had more pages than my hometown has people. My copy was so heavy that I sat atop the bar to give my hand a rest. The cover depicted the sepia-toned human skull and dwindling hourglass from Philippe de Campaign's Vanitas from 1671. An example of memento mori, an expression meaning remember that you too must die. This idea traces back to ancient Greece, appears throughout various religions, and pops up frequently in art. Think Hamlet chatting with Yorick's skull, or those little skeletons on Dia de los Muertos. "Looks like you've got yourself a beach read there," the bartender said. Then I admitted that I'd been lugging old Burton around shamefully unread for the last 15 years, though I'd never before brought him to a bar. I purchased the book shortly after graduating college, compelled by the curious perfection of the title, but more so by my own feelings of melancholy, which had cropped up from time to time. A strange way of self-medicating, perhaps, but I'd wondered if reading the longest, oddest, and most famous tome on my affliction might provide some insight. But the anatomy is the densest of books. Burton, a cloistered Oxford academic, added successive editions over the decades, expanding, explaining, compounding, and confounding his life's work until it spiraled into thorny brambles of labyrinthine ideas and ancient scholarship and sheer verbal gush with such eye-straining regularity that I'd only managed to read bits of it, tasty if puzzling snippets here and there. Now let me see if I got this straight, the bartender said. You're done with school, but now you're going to read that? She had a point. Poring over the gloomy musings of an English Renaissance scholar probably isn't the most relaxing way to spend one's leisure time, but Burton is both learned and ironic. For example, he explains by way of justifying the Sisyphean attempts to both perfect his treatise and to simultaneously cure himself of the titular disorder that idleness must be avoided at all costs. A right of melancholy, he declares, by being busy to avoid melancholy. And while he occasionally had his priorities out of whack, Burton was a self-professed aquapotor, or water drinker. He rightly shoots down those who would malign beer drinking. Quoting assorted, long-forgotten philosophers, he asserts that brew, 'tis a most wholesome and pleasant drink that's more subtle and better for the hop that rarefies it, and has a special virtue against melancholy. Notably, this follows an extended formal digression, which summarily denounces virtually every food one might feasibly consume. Pork is overly moist and packed with humors, and thus likely to cause a quartan ague, I'm not sure how to say that, a recurring fever, in other words, while rabbit meat is dark and hard to digest and tends to cause nightmares, whereas all venison is melancholy and begats bad blood, much as cheeses and curds only serve to increase one's incipient melancholy. Furthermore, racists and magnanimous discommend all fish, as fish are nutritionally slimy and breed viscosities. As for vegetables, Credo and company find few, if any, fit to eat, but cabbage is most troublesome of all, with Galen writing that cabbage makes for a heavy soul. And you can forget about parsnips and potatoes, because none other than the esteemed Berenius declares that all such roots windy and troublesome to the head. Finally, beans and peas are for naught, as they fill the brain with gross fumes, or so saith Isaac. But perhaps most indicative of the whole mad book is Burton's take on carp. Carp, Burton writes, is a fish of which I know not what to determine. He then proves this by weighing at excruciating length the opinions of learned carp experts such as Franciscus Bonsuetus, who describes carp as a muddy fish, and Hippolytus Sylvanus, who in his New York Times and Amazon.com best-selling classic on carp, De Piscia Natura El Proprione, criticizes carp for its slimy meat. On the other hand, Paulus Jovius approves of carp, as so doth Messrs. Dubravius and Freytagius, who puts it amongst the fishes of the best rank. In this way, Burton manages to wax philosophical on carp and every other subject under the sun without ever quite stating a definitive conclusion. So it's refreshing when, after rambling on and on like this until his reader is left in a glassy-eyed daze, Burton finally recommends a food that experts from the classical period through the Dark Ages and up into the Renaissance can argue is unlikely to cause melancholy: beer. Not to judge a book by its cover, the bartender said, but that looks like a downer. When I told her the book's subject was in fact the oldest downer known to mankind, depression, she wanted to know if it was like a medical book or if I meant the fellow who wrote it was depressed himself. A bit of both, I said, and fanned the impossible clump of pages, if that makes sense. He should have gotten himself some of that Prozac. I hear it works wonders. You know, I used to pop those things like certs, I said, but the bartender merely smirked and asked if I thought it helped any. And this was actually hard to say. Looking back, it's possible the pills had helped a little, at least at first, although that might have been just me hoping they would help. These days, I stick to what I know works, I told her, like beer and books. Well, I'm still not sure about that book of yours, she said, but I can definitely pour you a beer.